Thanks, Ben. Great job leading us. I want to welcome everybody in our campuses, Lockwood, Cody, Butte, Plentywood, and also those joining us by the web campus. Welcome. And we are in a series on Bout with Doubt. Before we get into that, I'd like to give you a couple of things that I'm going to ask you to do. One is the Reveal survey. You've heard about this the last few weeks, and we've asked you to kind of let us know how we're doing. This survey is an all-church, all-campuses survey to give us a heartbeat of what's going on all around this region. It's harder as you spread out and you have campuses all around Montana, Wyoming, and beyond to really know how things are communicating and delivering. So would you do us a favor and do that today, because it goes offline tonight, all right? I think it's at midnight. So if you would do that, it'll take you about 20 minutes, depending on how long it takes you to take surveys. It'll take you about 20 minutes, okay? All right. The second thing I'd like to show you is a new tool. Toy back office, but tool when you're communicating to your wife or somebody why you need to buy one. Okay, so anyway, this is a tool that we have around here called YouVersion. If you have a phone or an iPad, why don't you get that out? I'd like to show it to you. Many of you have talked to me about using this tool already. This is something that we're doing as an option for paper notes, and this is really handy. In order to access YouVersion, this is an app that shows up on either your iPhone or Droid or a smartphone like that, or on your iPad. And in order to access it, the first thing you would do is go to the apps in your, in however you download your apps, and find the one called YouVersion. You just type in, it's one word, YouVersion, and you'll find on there it says YouVersion or YouVersion Bible or YouVersion Bible app, something like that. Just tap on any one of those, and it'll download it onto your screen. All right? So once you've downloaded that, then you go to the YouVersion app and just click on it. All right? And when you do that, you'll see on the top left, there are like 3 lines. That's the menu. Click on that menu and look for live event. And that's at the bottom of the screen on mine. Once you get to that live event, you'll see search for live event or create an event. So you're going to click on search for live event, and it'll do 2 things. If it's located you or if it's using your current position, it'll give you whichever event is closest, which for us has the date, 4/27/28/2013, called A Bout with Doubt. And if you click on that, then it gets you into our notes. Now, the advantage of using this is it has the outline online. It's got it right here. And when Vern or I or somebody who's speaking gets to a passage, it has that passage that you can actually read along with it in the version that they're using. So you can just scroll down and do that. You can also, if you want to take notes, we're toying with putting it on, putting the outline on there so it's filled in. But then also the advantage of this is at the end, some of the announcements that we talk about here, especially announcements that are for this weekend, you have a direct link to them at the bottom, and it'll take you on to those, like the Freedom 5K run, the Mother-Son Challenge, Charlie Hall concert, Giving Online. Those are all direct clicks. You can click right onto that location on our website. So that's another tool for you. You might be interested in that. Give it a try. And so what we're going to do now, while you techies are playing around with that and not listening to me anyway, the rest of us are going to get into A Bout with Doubt. Okay? So if you'd go to your Bible and turn over to John chapter 8. A Bout with Doubt is a series that comes out of a survey that we took over the last month going up to Easter, and then on Easter weekend where we had, 4,500 people or so on all campuses. We asked them, what are your greatest doubts or fears about God and about the Bible? And so all of those came in. We compiled the themes together, and then based on which came first, we dealt with that and have just been going through those themes, those doubts. And so we call that a bout with doubt. These are the things that you fight over. This is the stuff that you struggle with internally to try to understand your faith. I was talking to someone this last week about some issues that create doubt, have in me, about what the Bible says and science and some of those kind of things. And this person has their degree and taught and knows the fields well. And they were saying, because of my relationship with God and things I've seen him do inside of me and around me, there are some things that I don't understand that I wrestle with, but at the same time, I'm putting all of my cards in with Christ. For me, that was a little bit startling. I thought it would be a little more confirmed. I know this is the truth, no doubts inside of me. But something that we said a few weeks back was, especially concerning the Bible, when there is no place for questions, there is no faith. Because faith implies a choice by gathering some of the evidence and landing on one side or the other. We're going to talk this week about the doubt that came in, one of the top doubts on salvation. It's not necessarily just what salvation is, but how do I know I can be saved? Can God really save me? Can he keep me saved? How does that work? And what about my family? Why are they so resistant to it? Or people who are close to it? Why don't they understand it the way that I understand it? Why can't they see the change going on in me and respond to that? I had a couple come up last night after the service and want to talk, and we went back into our office, and they began to weep and just say, our son was in Iraq, and when he came home, he had post-traumatic stress syndrome, and he took his life. He just couldn't handle it. What happened to him? Can God save him? What about us? What that does inside of us. All of us have had some kind of questions about God's ability to save, what that looks like, and his ability to work through us to save those people that are closest to us. So I'd like to take this out of John chapters 8 and 9 and just kind of introduce something that Jesus taught while he was on earth and explain what salvation is and why some people can accept it and other people remain in the dark. In John chapter 8, let's introduce this with verse 12. John 8:12 begins with Jesus declaring, I am the light of the world. He who follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of light. Now, an interesting context to this is that Jesus was in the Feast of the Tabernacles, Sukkot. This is called the Feast of Booths. It's a time when Israel remembers their wandering in the wilderness. In fact, in Jesus' day, from all over Israel and the surrounding nations, Jews would gather together in Jerusalem. And the numbers in that town would swell over 2 million people, many people believe. And they would set up booths that would resemble and remind them of when they camped out for 40 years as a nation in the wilderness. So these booths, even if they had a house in Jerusalem, they would set a booth up in their yard outside. Historians tell us that during this time, the Mount of Olives on the east side of Jerusalem would just be covered with these booths. Don't necessarily think of tents. They would actually gather some wood and materials from their area, leaves and that kind of thing, and set up this thing that they could camp in or stay in as a family for the week. They would gather food like they did in the wilderness. They would prepare it together kind of in their tribes and communities like they did in the wilderness. And primarily just remember how God delivered them out of slavery and brought them to the land of promise. This was a time of discovering what it meant to no longer be slaves and to be God's people. And that transition isn't an easy one, as you all know, if you've come to Christ out of a life of bondage in sin or into addiction. Now, Jesus begins by saying this in John 8:12. I am the light of the world. He who follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Now, remember, this is in the middle of the Feast of Tabernacles. All these Jews, thousands of Jews, coming into the temple to listen to Jesus speak. And Jesus says, I am the light of the world. What would they be thinking? They would be thinking back into the wilderness in Exodus, where it says that there was a cloud that came between Israel and the armies of Egypt when they were crossing the Red Sea. And that cloud, Exodus tells us, would provide darkness for Egypt so they couldn't make their way to the Israelites, and provided light to direct the path of Israel across the dry ground through the Red Sea. They would think he's the light of the world. And they would also realize that for some, that light actually created darkness. So if Jesus is the light of the world, and if he has changed you, why are some so resistant to that same gospel? Well, in John 8, there's a conflict with the people that you would think if anybody got it, they would. And then in John 9, John tells us a story about a man that if anybody wouldn't get it, he wouldn't, but he did. Let's look at this. Let's talk first about the barriers to salvation. What keeps some people from recognizing Christ as their forgiver, as the leader of their life? Well, John tells us about two groups who shouldn't have been, or they should have been people who would believe if anybody would. The first barrier to salvation that this brings up is simply self-reliance. Self-reliance. Let me show you this in John 8, verse 2. It says, early the next morning, this is possibly the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles, Jesus went back to the temple, and a crowd soon gathered, and he sat down and he taught them. And as he was speaking, the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery, and they put her in front of the crowds. So here's the picture. Packed temple. Jesus comes into the temple, famous rabbi, sits down to teach. A crowd of Jews gathers around him celebrating the Feast of Sukkot. And then in that crowd, as Jesus is teaching, the Pharisees parade in, very dramatically, I'm sure, with a woman that they had just caught in the very act of adultery. Takes two to tango, but somehow the guy wasn't there. Okay, so he comes in, and the religious leaders are there, set this woman up in front of him, and try to frame Jesus into saying, what are you going to do with her? The law says, stone her. Jesus, as the biblical rabbi, would say, okay, let's keep the law. Rome would arrest him for carrying out an execution without their authority. If he says, don't stone her, then he doesn't keep the law. He's framed. And that's what's going on in this context. The self-reliant people are trying to find reasons why they shouldn't follow Christ. Now, let me skip down to the idea of why were these people so resistant? The religious leaders in verse 13, if you look in chapter 8, verse 13, the Pharisees replied, you are making those claims about yourself. Your testimony isn't valid. Now, what were they saying? They were talking to Jesus about his teaching, and they said to him, we haven't verified what you're teaching. You haven't come to us for approval of that. Therefore, it's not valid. In the law, it was 2 or 3 witnesses, and they considered themselves to be the witnesses. So they wouldn't follow Christ because his testimony wasn't validated by them. And then Jesus said, there's a second group. It's the Pharisees, religious teachers, and then there's the Jews, the rest of them. And it says of them, if you look in verse 30, it says of them, many who heard him say these things believed in him. So the great multitude saw what was going on with the religious leaders and said, they don't like his message because it contradicts theirs. We get that. But his message resonates with us. And it says they believed. And then Jesus addresses them. Notice what he says in verse 31. Jesus said to the people who believed in him, "You are my true disciples if you remain faithful to my teachings, and you will know the truth, and that truth will set you free." Now that creates a dialogue between Jesus and this crowd of Jews. They say, well, we're not in slavery. Abraham's our father. And Jesus says to them, I tell you the truth. This isn't about Abraham. He says in verse 58, I tell you the truth, before Abraham was born, I am. He doesn't say, I was with Abraham. He says, before he was born, I always have been. Now, folks, there's only one who's eternal, and that's God. And the crowd didn't miss that. In fact, they rebelled against that. Something happens between when many believed in him, and by the end of this chapter 8, they're calling him a Samaritan and a devil. A Samaritan was more like a racial slur. A devil is pretty obvious that that's not a complimentary term. What happened in between? The thing that happened in between was while the religious leaders didn't like Jesus taking authority without their approval, the Jews as a nation, didn't like Jesus being their authority. It wasn't just that he was claiming to be God. They were really uncomfortable with this kind of God. Now, what's the solution to this self-reliance? The solution is Christ, a solution that they didn't want. In fact, the religious leaders wanted Christ to align with them. The people wanted to put God back onto a stained glass window in a cathedral. They could handle a distant God. They couldn't handle one that stood right next to them. That made it very uncomfortable. And friends, God wants to live in you and with you and have a relationship with you that doesn't feel like religion. It feels like God's walking with you and talking with you every day, not just in the temple, not just in a weekend worship experience, but every day in your life. That crowd wasn't interested. There's another barrier that we're introduced to in John chapter 9, and that's the barrier of family. What keeps some people from salvation, from discovering the light of life? Well, another barrier is family. If you look at John chapter 9, in verse 1, let me give you the context of what's going on in this chapter. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man who had been blind from birth. Rabbi, his disciples asked him, why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sins or his parents' sins? Okay, it sounds kind of harsh, but here's what the rabbis taught. Some people would sin inside of the womb and be guilty at birth, and therefore their judgment followed them. That's how they explained deformities and handicaps that come at birth. Kind of brutal. And so they're asking, was it at birth or was it his parents' sin that he's being judged for? The law taught that God would not look over the sins, but he would, in fact, judge the sins to the second and third generation. And so they were asking, is this something that his parents had done that he's being judged for? Now, notice Jesus' response to that. Verse 3, it was not because of his sins or his parents' sins, Jesus answered. This happened so that the power of God could be seen in him. In other words, this man was born for this moment. We must quickly carry out the tasks assigned to us by the one who sent us. The night is coming, and then no one can work. But while I am here in the world, I am the light of the world. Notice what he's saying. He's saying simply this. Again, in John chapter 8, he introduces the theme of being the light of the world at the Feast of the Tabernacles. Now in John 9, he introduces them to a blind man, and he says, I'm the light of the world. I'm going to bring light into this man's life. When the blind man is healed, the religious leaders have to deal with the miracle with these crowds. So what they decide to do after this man comes back healed is they decide to take him to court. We've got to take care of this. We've got to eliminate this threat. And so they bring the blind man and question him, and they try to get him to do three things. First of all, admit that he was never blind. Well, that didn't work. So the second thing that they asked him was admit that Jesus didn't heal him. And that didn't work. So the third thing was, okay, you were blind and now you can see, but it wasn't Jesus that did it because God doesn't heal through Jesus. That just can't happen. And that didn't work. So then they bring in his family. What's your family like? All of us have different experiences with families, but some of you recognize that some of the most resistant people to your relationship with God can be your family. When you meet somebody, how anxious are you to introduce them to your family? When my kids start to date, one of the pleasures of my life is be able to introduce myself to the people that they date, whether they offer that introduction or not. It's a fun thing. I was, Duck Dynasty, anybody heard of Duck Dynasty? Yeah, so I was watching one of those episodes and Willie was talking about how one of the joys of his life is to, when his daughter, 14-year-old daughter, was going to a dance with a boy that he had never met, he said, okay, one of the greatest joys, they took him out hunting. He said, I feel very good about interviewing this potential date with a shotgun in my hand. So takes him out hunting, and he said, one of the greatest experiences for me is to see a smile of joy on my daughter's face and the look of absolute terror on the face of her date. I don't know what your family is like, but when this family shows up here to be interviewed by the religious leaders, it was not a stellar moment for them. In fact, when they come, they, in verse 18 of John chapter 9, let me read what happens. The Jewish leaders still refused to believe that the man had been born blind and could now see. So they call in his parents and they ask him, is this your son? Was he born blind? If so, how can he now see? So let's frame the parents. So his parents replied, we know this is our son, that he was born blind, but we don't know how he can see or who healed him. Asked him. He's old enough to speak for himself. Well, that's nice. Not a stellar moment here for the parents. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders who had announced that anyone saying Jesus was Messiah would be expelled from the synagogue. That's why they said, he's old enough, ask him. So at this point, the parents are embarrassed by the son. Now, let me give you an illustration of this. I was looking online this last week at embarrassing family photos. Have you ever seen these? Somebody posted some family photos from my family way back on Facebook, and we tried to get it off, but since they didn't. On the left side, this is kind of a normal Olin Mills, remember the day, kind of photo. I'm not going to tell you which one's mine because it won't help. The one on the right is the era do you have eras in your family that you wish you had missed? So that's that. But they're even better, more embarrassing family photos. Here's one of a boy who goes with his family to visit Santa Claus. The boys, the other three seem to really enjoy it. It didn't go so well for the youngest, evidently. Here's another one. Family photo, everybody get on the couch. So sick of this. I hate this. Well, now we all know. Here's another family photo. Let's send Grandma a thank you note for the present. Little sister tried to take the present. I got it back. Thank you, Grandma. I love that picture. All right, the next one is, okay, so Dad's had 3 daughters, still hasn't quite adjusted in his mind to what that looks like. They dress up, looks like the curtains, but still, they look nice compared to, all right, here's the next one. He's pretty impressed with himself. That'll make a great family photo. Okay, so anyway, families can be embarrassing, can't they? When a family is embarrassed by your faith and they seem lost in the darkness, how does the message get back to them? How do they become convinced and salvation comes into the house? Well, After the parents are interviewed, and that didn't work out for them, they went back to the blind man. So before the parents' story and after the parents' story comes the blind man's story. And so here's the solution to another barrier of faith with your family. The solution is your story plus time. Just live out your story in front of them. Don't be embarrassed by it. Tell them about it, but give it time. Your story plus time. And there's a third failure, and that's our greatest fear, I think, is failure. The third barrier to salvation is our failure. For this, the Jews were in the temple observing the Feast of Tabernacles. They have imposed on the crowds for years these very strict rules and rituals on top of the law to make sure that they don't break the law. So if you keep these rules, then you stay away from even the potential of breaking the law. Rules that have become a burden to the nation. The religious leaders were struggling to keep their position of status. John shows them bringing a woman caught in the act of adultery to Jesus to judge. They were setting him up for failure, just as they had been doing with the people they were leading. In us, one of the greatest setups for failure, it seems to me, is our own personal failure. It's the pressure we put on ourselves. It's the pressure others put on us. It may be pressure that you had from home saying you need to be like this, and if you're not acceptable, you're not good enough. But the potential for failure and what that brings into us keeps us from going to God for his grace. Look at verse 1 of John chapter 9. Notice what he says. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man who had been blind from birth. So here's the blind man. He puts mud on his eyes, made by his own spit, and then he tells him, I want you to go down to the pool of Siloam and wash off that mud, and you'll be able to see. Notice verse 6. Then he spit on the ground, made mud with saliva, and spread the mud over the blind man's eyes, and he told him, go wash yourself in the pool of Siloam. Siloam means sent. So the man went and washed and came back seeing. Now, here's just a simple thing that God gave this blind man a task to do, and that task was just go wash the mud off of your eyes. A simple task. Not necessarily that simple for him, but all he's looking for at this moment is money. He's not looking for anything from Jesus. He didn't ask him to restore his sight. He didn't ask him to save him. He didn't ask him for money. He wasn't asking Jesus for anything. And yet, even with his low expectations, Jesus stopped. And he rubs mud on his eyes and tells him he can be healed. What keeps you? What keeps you from trusting God for your forgiveness and to keep you saved? Many times it's our failure. It's our own failure. A few years ago, I went through a great failure in my life, and I've been following the Lord since I was 16, and yet I had totally failed. Not only in my own expectations, but in the expectations of what I perceived to be expectations from my family, from people that I worked with. I thought they were God's expectations for me as well, and I struggled with God. I had been praying God would change me. He didn't. I prayed that God would change other people. He didn't. I prayed in a bout of a little bit of humility. Okay, then God, change us. Change us. There's something in me too. And then finally just said, I'll forget it. If it doesn't matter to you, then I won't let it matter to me, and that'll hurt a little less, I thought. After going through my history with God of pursuing him with all that I knew I could do, where had it gotten me? And finally I prayed a prayer that I wouldn't recommend, and I'm not even sure is a very good one, but it was where I was at. And it was simply this: God, I am no longer going to stop running after you. I'm no longer going to I'm no longer going to be pursuing you. I'm going to let you pursue me. That was scary. What if he didn't? Well, I didn't feel worthy of pursuing. But what if God didn't either? What if he didn't pursue me? Have you ever felt that? Then in the process of when I started letting go and I stopped doing some of the disciplines that I had worked so meticulously at, I stopped pursuing God and it's interesting. Amber alert. Yeah. Okay. Are you with me? I'm not sure I am, but follow me, track me. Poignant moment in the message. All right. In this process of saying, God, I'm not going to do all these things that I've been doing and depending on them in order to be blessed, I ran across this verse in Psalm 46, and it says this: stop your striving and recognize that I am God. I will be exalted over the nations. I will be exalted over the earth. Stop striving. It hit me. That's what I had just done. And as I let that sink in, I looked up that word in the Hebrew for striving, and that word is a word, rapha. You ever heard of that word? Some of you might have. It's a word used for healing. God's healing. It's interpreted or it's translated several different ways. To let go of the rope, somebody who's leading a group of horses, to let easy on the ropes, to grow slack, to release, to sink down, for a bird to drop your wings and quit flying, to relax. Cease striving and know that I am God. And when I read that, I thought my life has been characterized by striving, by trying to make this thing work. And perhaps in this failure, I find God. I found the answer to failure: scandalous grace. I like this term, scandalous grace, because grace is something I don't earn. I didn't deserve it. I never have, and I never will. No matter what I do before God saved me or since he saved me, it's a gift. It's scandalous because it's not how most people react to God. Like the religious leaders and the Jews who are saying, okay, you've got to do it this way, fit under our law and our commands. It's the Jews who are saying, we like what you say, but we don't like your authority walking right next to us. It's too personal. It's in my space. I don't want that. Now to someone who's finally broken and comes to Christ and says, cease striving. And it's almost at that moment, after I had been fighting all these battles and these wars, that I collapse. And God, who's been standing on the sideline waiting, comes up and says, finally, now let's get busy and fight. And I noticed what he said in verse 11. He says, the Lord who commands heaven's armies is on our side. The God of Jacob is my protector. Finally, I don't have to fight this battle. Will I fail? Yep. God's there fighting with me and for me and against my enemies. Cease striving and know that I'm God. The barriers to salvation, I think, are these. I think first, there's self-reliance. Second, I think family issues. Third, my own failures. If those are barriers, then what is salvation? At the end of chapter 9, after Jesus had gone to the blind man and put mud on his eyes, sent him to the pool of Siloam, and he'd come back seeing, he'd gone through all of this proof to the objectors that Jesus could have healed him. After all of that, Jesus again comes and finds him. And notice in verse 35 of John 9, when Jesus heard what had happened, that he had been kicked out of the temple for his defending his being able to see, he found the man and he asked, do you believe in the Son of Man? It's almost after I stopped fighting and God comes back to me with that verse in Psalm and says, do you believe I can fight for you? The first thing I notice about what salvation is that God initiates it. God initiates salvation. The difference in John 8 is that the Jews and the religious leaders came to Jesus. In John chapter 9, Jesus went to the blind man. At the beginning of the chapter, he goes to the blind man and initiates his healing. At the end of the chapter, he goes and seeks out the blind man again with the message, with the gospel. He initiates. He found the man. You don't have to go searching for God, friends. He's right in front of you, seeking you out. In fact, you're here right now because God is seeking you. He's seeking you out. A second thing I notice about salvation from this is in verse 36, and that is, I have to respond when God finds me. The man answered, "Who is he, sir? I want to believe him." Does that resonate with you? You might be here this weekend because you're thinking, there's something there that I'm missing. I'm not sure what it is. Not even sure I trust a church to give it to me, but I'm going to go listen and see. And here's the same message of the man saying, who? You can heal me and give me sight. I trust you to tell me who is the Son of Man. Now, what God had given this man to do in response was simple, but it wasn't that easy. Notice here in this map of Jerusalem, this is a first century reproduction of what Jerusalem would have looked like. Notice what is central in Jerusalem. It's the temple. How massive it is. Jesus, because he was celebrating the Feast of Booths, the Feast of Sukkot, after he was in the temple teaching, would have been leaving the temple, and you see the gate going to across the Kidron Valley here on the east side, which is the front center of your screen. And he would have crossed that bridge to get over to the Mount of Olives. As he came out of the temple, that's where he found the blind man, who was waiting by the temple for those worshipers going in and out in order to ask money from them. He asks the blind man to go wash the mud off at the pool of Siloam. Where's that? If you look on this reproduction, you'll notice the wall that goes all the way to the left side center of your screen. The pool of Siloam is below that. Let me show you this map that shows you a little bit of elevation. Notice how steep that hill is. Some of you here have been to Israel and have walked that. It's a very steep climb. It's a very steep incline if you're going down from the temple. And it's a long way. It's a couple of miles. And Jesus didn't offer to help him out. He didn't send Andrew and say, "Hey, Andrew, would you help this blind man?" No, he didn't. Why not? Because there's a response required in order to be a follower of Christ. It's one thing for Jesus to find you and invite you, but you have to respond and say, "I accept." God respects your personal choice and your will, and he offers himself, but he doesn't force himself. Down at the Pool of Siloam, this is a reproduction that archaeologists have put together based on digs that they've made. Notice that in this pool, it would have been a gathering place. Because of the nature of Israel at that time, it would have been hot, but inside with all this pool, it would have been a cool place to gather. It would be a place people would come to get their water for the day. As the blind man goes there and he washes, imagine he washes the mud from his eyes. When he opens his eyes, he can see. Do you think he was kind of like, I'm so embarrassed, I can see? Probably not. Everybody at the pool knew. And then he goes rushing back to the temple to find out who this man was that just healed him. A response is required. Have you responded? And a third part of salvation is I will recognize Jesus. I'll acknowledge him as God's only solution. In John 9, Jesus says to this man, "You have seen him." That's significant, saying that to a blind man. "You have seen him," Jesus said, "and he is speaking to you." And notice his response. "Then yes, Lord, yes, I believe." He made a response because Jesus was God, the one who was able to heal him. And then fourthly, I will follow Jesus. Notice what this man does once he recognizes Jesus and accepts that he's God's son able to heal him. It says he worshiped Jesus. Worship means that this man expressed his gratitude to Jesus in some way. Throughout the Gospels, that worship took a lot of different forms. John the Baptist worshiped Jesus by announcing Jesus to the crowds. The disciples worshiped Jesus by following him. Many who were healed worshiped by bowing before Jesus and thanking him. Mary, the sister of Lazarus, worshiped Jesus by using very expensive perfume to anoint his feet. Mary Magdalene, apparently, after Jesus rose from the dead, just grabbed Jesus somehow so that he had to tell her, Mary, let me go. Not time for this kind of worship. How do you worship? Worship is simply this. Worship is discovering something about God and responding appropriately. We do worship here on the weekends by singing, by praying, by learning, by responding to what the Word says, but we do worship every day by living it out in our context at home, at work, at play. Anything that we do is a response to who Jesus is and how he fits into our life in a relationship. Notice verse 40. How do the crowds respond to this blind man receiving sight? The person who shouldn't have seen Jesus sees him. Notice what they say in verse 40. Some Pharisees who were standing nearby heard Jesus and asked, "Are you saying we are blind? This blind man receives sight, and you're saying we, though we can see, are blind?" And Jesus says to them, notice, if you were blind, you wouldn't be guilty. But you remain guilty because you claim you can see. It's the person who comes to failure. It's the person who's self-reliant. It's the person who has all this resistance from their family who says, I'll handle it. I'll take care of all that. I'm going to make this work, that are blind. But the person who comes to that point of self-reliance, that point of resistance from others, that point of personal failure and says, I can't. I need Jesus. Some of you know the story of John Newton, who wrote the song Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. John Newton was a slave trader. He captained a ship where over his life captured over 20,000 slaves and took them to markets all around East India and England and sold these slaves. Many of them died en route, if not half. He was haunted by this later on in life, but the reason was he was in a storm at sea, and the ship was going down. And he prayed as the ship was going down, God, if you'll save me, I'll serve you the rest of my life. If I'm God, I'm thinking, it's not that good of a deal, but okay. And so God saves him, and John Newton becomes a pastor and becomes a mentor for a man named William Wilberforce. Wilberforce was a parliamentarian, and he was trying to abolish slave trade under the tutelage of John Newton. And John and Wilberforce meet together to talk about how they can work together with Newton's story along with Wilberforce's influence in Parliament. And what Newton discovers in going back and discovering God's grace over his life and his guilt over the lives of 20,000 slaves is a story of grace. Two things I know. I'm a great sinner, and Christ is a great Savior. Let's pray.